SAMHSA's concept of trauma and guidance for a trauma-informed approach. This was prepared by SAMHSA's Trauma and Justice Strategic Initiative, July 2014. The 3 E's of trauma: events, experience of events, and effect. Events and circumstances may include the actual or extreme threat of physical or psychological harm, example, natural disasters, violence, etc., or severe life-threatening neglect of a child that imperils healthy development. These events and circumstances may occur as a single occurrence or repeatedly over time. This element of SAMHSA's concept of trauma is represented in the 5th version of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM-5, which requires all conditions classified as trauma and stress-related disorders to include exposure to a traumatic or stressful event as a diagnostic criterion. The individual's experience of these events or circumstances helps to determine whether it is a traumatic event. A particular event may be experienced as traumatic for one individual and not for another. Example, a child removed from an abusive home experiences this differently than their sibling. One refugee may experience fleeing one's country differently from another refugee. One military veteran may experience deployment to a war zone as traumatic, while another veteran is not similarly affected. How the individual labels, assigns meaning to, and is disrupted physically and psychologically by an event will contribute to whether or not it is experienced as traumatic. Traumatic events, by their very nature, set up a power differential where one entity, whether an individual, an event, or a force of nature, has power over another. They elicit a profound question of why me? The individual's experience of these events or circumstances is shaped in the context of this powerlessness and questioning. Feelings of humiliation, guilt, shame, betrayal, and silencing often shape the experience of the event. When a person experiences physical or sexual abuse, it is often accompanied by a sense of humiliation, which can lead the person to feel as though they are bad or dirty, leading to a sense of self-blame, shame, and guilt. In cases of war or natural disasters, those who survived the traumatic event may blame themselves for surviving when others did not. Abuse by a trusted caregiver frequently gives rise to feelings of betrayal, shattering a person's trust and leaving them feeling alone. Often abuse of children and domestic violence are accompanied by threats that lead to silencing and fear of reaching out for help. How the event is experienced may be linked to a range of factors, including the individual's cultural beliefs. Example, the subjugation of women and the experience of domestic violence. The availability of social supports, whether isolated or embedded in a supportive family or community structure, or to the developmental stage of the individual. An individual may understand and experience events differently at age 5, 15, or 50. The long-lasting adverse effects of the event are a critical component of trauma. These adverse effects may occur immediately or may have a delayed onset. The duration of the effects can be short to long term. In some situations, the individual may not recognize the connection between the traumatic events and the effects. Examples of adverse effects include individuals' inability to cope with the normal stresses and strains of daily living, to trust and benefit from relationships, to manage cognitive processes such as memory, attention, thinking, to regulate behavior, or to control the expression of emotions. In addition to these more visible effects, there may be an altering of one's neurobiological makeup and ongoing health and well-being. Advances in neuroscience and an increased understanding of the interaction of neurobiological and environmental factors have documented the effects of such threatening events. Traumatic effects, which may range from hypervigilance to a constant state of arousal, to numbing, to avoidance, can eventually wear a person down, physically, mentally, and emotionally. Survivors of trauma have also highlighted the impact of these events on spiritual beliefs and the capacity to make meaning of these experiences. SAMHSA's trauma-informed approach, key assumptions and principles. Trauma researchers, practitioners, and survivors have recognized that the understanding of trauma and trauma-specific interventions is not sufficient to optimize outcomes for trauma survivors, nor to influence how service systems conduct their business. The context in which trauma is addressed or treatments deployed contributes to the outcomes for the trauma survivors, the people receiving services, and the individuals staffing the systems. Referred to variably as trauma-informed care or trauma-informed approach, this framework is regarded as essential to the context of care. SAMHSA's concept of a trauma-informed approach is grounded in a set of 4 assumptions and 6 key principles. A program, organization, or system that is trauma-informed realizes the widespread impact of trauma and understands potential paths for recovery, recognizes the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients, families, staff, and others involved with the system, and responds by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices, and seeks to actively resist re-traumatization. A trauma-informed approach is distinct from trauma-specific services or trauma systems. A trauma-informed approach is inclusive of trauma-specific interventions, whether assessment, treatment, or recovery supports. Yet it also incorporates key trauma principles into the organizational culture. Referred to variably as trauma-informed care or trauma-informed approach, this framework is regarded as essential to the context of care. The 4 R's, key assumptions in a trauma-informed approach. In a trauma-informed approach, all people at all levels of the organization or system have a basic realization about trauma and understand how trauma can affect families, groups, organizations, and communities, as well as individuals. People's experience and behavior are understood in the context of coping strategies designed to survive adversity and overwhelming circumstances. Whether these occurred in the past, example, a client dealing with a prior child abuse, whether they are currently manifesting, example, a staff member living with domestic violence in the home, or whether they are related to the emotional distress that results in hearing about the first-hand experiences of another. Example, secondary traumatic stress experienced by a direct care professional. There is an understanding that trauma plays a role in mental and substance use disorders and should be systematically addressed in prevention, treatment and recovery settings. Similarly, there is a realization that trauma is not confined to the behavioral health specialty service sector, but is integral to other systems: child welfare, criminal justice, primary health care, peer-run and community organizations, and is often a barrier to effective outcomes in those systems as well. People in the organization or system are also able to recognize the signs of trauma. These signs may be gender, age, or setting specific and may be manifest by individuals seeking or providing services in these settings. Trauma screening and assessment assist in the recognition of trauma, as do workforce development, employee assistance, and supervision practices. The program, organization, or system responds by applying the principles of a trauma-informed approach to all areas of functioning. The program, organization, or system integrates an understanding that the experience of traumatic events impacts all people involved, whether directly or indirectly. Staff in every part of the organization, from the person who greets clients at the door to the executives and the governance board, have changed their language, behaviors, and policies to take into consideration the experiences of trauma among children and adult users of the services and among staff providing the services. This is accomplished through staff training, a budget that supports this ongoing training, and leadership that realizes the role of trauma in the lives of their staff and the people they serve. The organization has practitioners trained in evidence-based trauma practices. Policies of the organization, such as mission statements, staff handbooks, and manuals, promote a culture based on beliefs about resilience, recovery, and healing from trauma. For instance, the agency's mission may include an intentional statement on the organization's commitment to promote trauma recovery. Agency policies demonstrate a commitment to incorporating perspectives of people served through the establishing of client advisory boards or inclusion of people who have received services on the agency's board of directors, or agency training, including resources for mentoring supervisors on helping staff address secondary traumatic stress. The organization is committed to providing a physically and psychologically safe environment. Leadership ensures that staff work in an environment that promotes trust, fairness, and transparency. The program's organization or systems response involves a universal precautions approach in which one expects the presence of trauma in lives of individuals being served, ensuring not to replicate it. A trauma-informed approach seeks to resist re-traumatization of clients as well as staff. Organizations often inadvertently create stressful or toxic environments that interfere with the recovery of clients, the well-being of staff, and the fulfillment of the organizational mission. Staff who work within a trauma-informed environment are taught to recognize how organizational practices may trigger painful memories and re-traumatize clients with trauma histories. For example, they recognize that using restraints on a person who has been sexually abused or placing a child who has been neglected or abandoned in a seclusion room may be re-traumatizing and interfere with healing and recovery.